like to introduce our executive director. Ivy Clark has been with the Newburgh Museum since March 1st and in the position of executive director. She has been with us since last September, though, in various other positions. Ivy is the very best executive director that the Newburgh Museum has ever had. And in fact, she's our first executive director. She recently graduated summa cum laude from the University of Evansville. She's also a product of Castle High School. She was a drum major for the Castle Marching Knights. And she ended up in this career, and we're not going to let her out until she retires. Here is Ivy Clark.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I greatly appreciate it. I'm very excited for tonight's event. So today you are here to watch the film Tuskegee Airmen, Indiana. And tonight we have the producer and film writer himself, Stephen Witte, who will be accepting questions and answers at the end of the film. So please keep in mind and just enjoy. Thank you all for coming. I hope you all enjoyed the cookies and refreshments. And may we get started.
Black History Month 2024 marks the 2-year anniversary of the debut for Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana, held at Memorial Baptist Church in Evansville, only 2 hours southwest of the film's setting.
In front of that debut was 3 years of development in start and stop fashion. Part of the reason was the pandemic that shut down filmmaking everywhere, and part of the reason was building the right team to get it made.
While working on Owen's film, Never Lose Hope, I mentioned another project that he might be interested in, a documentary about a unit of the Tuskegee Airmen based for a time during World War II in Indiana, and the racially charged incidents that happened here.
As President Harry Truman once said, the only thing new in this world is the history you don't know. That was exactly the case with this story of the 477th Bomber Group.
With Owen's project completed, we started on the Tuskegee film. An important decision early on was the choice of a narrator. After a lengthy period of getting referrals and screening videos, we made the ideal choice of Reverend Adrian Brooks, senior pastor at Memorial Baptist Church.
Every screening that we've attended, including members of the audience commending his narration.
His contribution extends beyond that of a narrator. Pastor Brooks instills life within the film.
And that life has included screenings at several film festivals, including a limited showing in Indianapolis during this year's Black History Month.
We are grateful for the embrace of this film and its message.
Despite the heroic efforts against fascism overseas, Black Americans serving in World War II still face discrimination and aggression at home. Our film presents a thin slice of their experiences in military service as we focus on one unit of the famed Tuskegee Airmen, who stood up for equality and their own bases.
The actions of the officers of the 477th represent a beginning, one that led to desegregating the U.S. military through the executive order President Truman signed in 1948. Not that a stroke of a pen created results overnight, but it recognized what started with the Tuskegee Airmen as the way of the future.
It is our great pleasure to have made this film and have the opportunity to share its background with you.
We invite you to check out the website for more information about the 477th, the filmmakers, and to celebrate the message of Tuskegee Airmen in Indiana.
Aviation cadets were being groomed to fly warplanes of a unit which was then a unit in thought only, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. These men were pioneers of a venture so new that you who stand here before me now, after 3 years, may still be considered forerunners in the movement which has given you a place in the fighting men of the sky.
When you hear about the Tuskegee Airmen or see a P-51 fighter plane with its tail painted red, you might think that's the only aircraft they flew. The first black pilots in American military history flew more than single-engine, single-seat fighter planes. Tuskegee pilots also flew twin-engine bombers. These were bigger aircraft with a flight crew of 4 to 6 members. But the bomber crews faced a different battle than the fighter pilots. 4 squadrons of Tuskegee-trained pilots formed the 332nd Fighter Group. They flew P-51 Mustangs to escort bombers and attack ground targets. The squadrons flew from bases in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. The first enemy aircraft claimed by a Tuskegee Airman happened on July 2nd, 1943, when a member of the 99th Fighter Squadron downed a Focke-Wulf 190, the most effective Luftwaffe fighter of the war. The pilot was First Lieutenant Charles Blakesley Hall from Brazil, Indiana. Their training started at an airfield near the Tuskegee Institute. Training black civilian pilots began there before the war. The region enjoyed good flying weather much of the time. Another reason for selecting Tuskegee for training was because the area presented a segregated environment. This was in step with the Army's segregated training policies of those times. Daniel Hallman of the Air Force Historical Research Agency wrote that one of Franklin Roosevelt's promises during his campaign for a third term as U.S. president was creating opportunities for black pilots in military aviation. The War Department followed through in 1941, but their training and unit assignments were segregated. He also wrote that white officers were the first commanders of flying units composed of black pilots. The first black officers to command came later. The most famous of them was Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. He was a West Point graduate and later became the first black general in the Air Force. When Colonel Davis took command, the 99th Fighter Squadron had become part of the 332nd Fighter Group and was based in Italy. The 332nd logged a total of 112 enemy aircraft destroyed. 3 of these were the Germans' jet-powered Me-262, making these Tuskegee Airmen among the few Allied pilots to take their propeller-driven P-51s up against the Luftwaffe's high-performance fighters. The German pilots that took notice of their combat skills, giving them the nickname the Black Birdmen. The pilots of 332nd got another nickname, the Red Tails, because the tails of some of their planes were painted red. By the end of the war in Europe, they flew 1,800 combat missions, consisting of 15,533 sorties. In June 1943, when Colonel Davis assumed command, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bomber Group were combined into the 477th Composite Group. He was assigned the task untangling the problems facing the 477th, problems that began from the day the Bomber Group was activated. Understanding how they came to be starts and ends with the tensions around policies of segregation. Those tensions reached a breaking point when the Bomber Group was stationed in Indiana. The Army Air Force organized a bomber unit in mid-1943 called the 477th Bombardment Group. This group consisted of black flight crews and ground support teams. They were assigned the B-25, a twin-engine, medium-weight bomber. Designed by North American Aviation, over 9,800 B-25s were built for World War II duty. The aircraft is perhaps best known for the Doolittle raid on Japan. The raid happened in April of 1942, when 16 B-25s launched from the Hornet aircraft carrier. The B-25 endeared herself to flight crews for her safe, forgiving handling in the air and her sturdy build. The aircraft could take a tremendous beating and keep flying, even with one engine out. What crews complained about was the high noise level inside the plane. The B-25 was so hard on the ears of its pilots that many suffered some hearing loss. Despite the flight crews of the 477th Bombardment Group having an airplane to meet their combat needs, they never got the chance to fly in any combat theater. Reports published about the 477th mentioned the indifference of the group's white officers who used their postings for moving to higher ranks. Consequently, one report said the 477th represented segregation at its worst. The 477th moved from airbase to airbase, never receiving enough classroom time for training the flight crews, splitting squadrons among different airfields. For example, they were moved from MacDill Field in Florida to Godman Field in Kentucky, then 2 airfields in Indiana, Freeman Field near Seymour and Atterbury Field near Columbus. The reason for 2 fields was that Freeman had the facilities for housing the unit, but its ramps and runways were too small for the B-25 bombers they flew. The unit's aircraft were based at Atterbury. They were in the Hoosier State for a single month, but it was long enough to make history. What became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny symbolized unit commander Colonel Robert Selway's disregard of the War Department's regulations forbidding segregation of public spaces. That included Freeman Field's Officers Club. It was here the officers of the 477th took a stand. Faced with separate and unequal facilities, the officers presented themselves at the White Officers Club on April 5th, 1945. They were denied entry, but brushed past the white officer on duty to get inside the club. A publication issued by the National Park Service in 2016 said that over 60 officers of the 477th were arrested the next night for attempting to enter the White Officers Club. In response, Colonel Selway issued an order assigning officers to clubs by race. He went further to include segregation of housing and dining halls. He then demanded black officers sign statements agreeing to the order. Over 100 officers of the 477th refused to sign the statement, amounting to a refusal to obey an order from a superior officer. In time of war, it was an offense punishable by death. These officers were placed under arrest, transferred back to Godman Field in Kentucky, and held under armed guard. Godman Field also held German prisoners of war. Just as the Germans had noticed the flying skills of the Red Tails over Europe, they noticed the treatment these officers received in their own country. The German officers of war were quick to ask, "Why are you fighting for a country that doesn't want you?" Testimonials from black service members in World War II convey their understanding of a double consciousness, that is, the duty to serve their country, while knowing their service would not provide them with full access to society back home due to Jim Crow segregation. The WWII campaign, which meant victory at home and abroad, promoted the fight for democracy overseas and at home for black veterans returning from the war. News of Selway's orders, the arrest of officers from the 477th, and subsequent charges spread through the press, labor unions, and Congress. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall eventually ordered the release of the officers, but this wasn't the end. Colonel Selway lost his command and was replaced by Colonel Benjamin Davis. The Army brass judged him as the right man to lead a force that combined the fighter and bomber groups into the 477th Composite Group. In late May 1945, Army Air Force Commanding General Henry Arnold replaced the white officer group over the 477th with black officers commanded by Colonel Davis. Plans were made to send the B-25 group and the fighters at Godman Field to the Pacific to fight the war against Japan. But the war in the Pacific ended before they could deploy. It took until 1995 for removal of letters of reprimand placed in the personnel files of some officers, following the charges being dropped in their cases. Others were removed upon request, and a pardon issued for one officer whose case went to trial. The Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 in recognition of their unique military record, which inspired revolutionary reform in the armed forces. In the end, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen has many chapters, with only 2 described here. First, the fighter group, who flew into history as the Red Tails. They were fierce defenders of Allied bombers against enemy aircraft and potent destroyers of enemy ground positions. Second, the bomber groups, who waged a successful battle against racial indifference and segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen overcame the harshness of racism in the military by exhibiting bravery and courage during times of great peril. Their actions gained them the respect of military and political leadership and their fellow service members. Air Force historian Daniel Hallman summed up their contributions this way: the Tuskegee Airmen fought two enemies, the Nazis overseas and racism at home, and truly fought so that others would be free.
On the day of the recording, Pastor and I worked together very carefully. He came in ready to go. He really knew the lines. He knew how he wanted to deliver them. And I believe, if I remember correctly, he went through start to finish 3 times. And what you have here is what came from all of that. As with this project, let me back up a minute. This particular project as a documentary is a little bit different than something where you're filming an original narrative. Different from where you are setting up scenes, you're setting up wardrobe, you have lights, you have an original script, you have actors. So this was obviously a compressed group from what you might see in larger productions. So that's why being a producer on this was not tremendously overtaxing. For me, what it involved, well, what I like to tell people is being a producer meant I did what Owen told me to do. But there was a little more to it than that. I gathered all of the resources that we needed to make the film. That included the script, that included the vintage images, that included the stills. And then we did some interviews, and we talked to a lot of historical people around the state. After the first rough cut, I decided that we needed more images. So we went back and cast a wider net. We went to the Hoosier Archive, and we went to some places in Indianapolis and found some great material, what you see there. Any project in film is a team effort. There can be stresses, there can be unforeseen circumstances. There can also be a lot of pleasant surprises. We had all of that here. A question that I often receive is, where do the ideas for film come from? What are the inspirations? And my answer always is, everywhere. For example, I was waiting to pick up a to-go order at a certain restaurant down in Evansville. It was mid-afternoon, so it wasn't very crowded. There were just dots of people at tables through the restaurant. And it struck me, what if during this downtime in the restaurant, for these regular patrons, they come in and there's some mystical experience that happens. You know, we're working that out. It might be a short story. It might eventually become a short film. But the idea came when I wasn't even looking for one. There's a lot of filmmakers that will tell you they wake up in the middle of the night with an idea. They'll jump out of bed and start working on it no matter what the time. Documentaries like the one we just watched have their own unique sources of inspiration. There's another one that we're developing that was inspired by a YouTube video. This video was about the Velvet Revolution 20 years ago, or it was the 20th anniversary video of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. So that's something that's on the burner. To get specific to Tuskegee, it came from a North High School student's senior history project. His name was Caden, and he had an interest in aviation and in World War II. At that time, I was the director of exhibits and design at Evansville Wartime Museum. He found us, we got a little team together, and as we were talking, we were having kind of a difficult time focusing where we were going to help him, what were our efforts going to be. And somebody brought in something about a unit of the Tuskegee, the bombing unit, that had been in Evansville, that had been in Indiana for a month, such a short time. And as we dug into it, we found out that that month changed history. It changed the history for the military. So we realized that we had something to bite into. We started our research. So the way the film came about, we had a history project. We had a research project. We began doing the work on the script. We got things ready for Caden's senior presentation. We didn't get the final film done, but we got enough done that he got an A, so there was a happy ending. There was a happy ending on all of that. The actual film was several years later, what with the pandemic, what with getting everybody's schedules worked out, and you know, we were talking before, I think it was Ryan, it sat in a drawer for 2 years, which is what sometimes happens to projects. This one was fortunate enough to make it out. So the film premiered at Pastor Brooks' church on the last Sunday of Black History Month about 2.5 years ago. We were delighted with the response. Since then, it has been shown in film festivals in Evansville, in Bloomington, and a number of times in Indianapolis. There's a film festival organizer there who has kind of taken this film under his wing, and he showed it again in February during Black History Month. He shows it at every festival he has a chance to. So we're very grateful to him. The other thing that he really focuses on is films that are Indiana made, Indiana crewed and Indiana produced and paid for. Now, my wife's in the front row, so we're not going to talk a whole lot about what things cost. But we've self-financed most of our projects. But thinking about Indiana and World War II and visiting the Newburgh Museum yesterday put me in mind of the richness of the contributions from this area to the war effort. And I went back and found a few historical notes relating to Warwick County, you know, where we are right now. And I wanted to, if you'll indulge me, I want to share those with you. First, there's the USS Warwick. This is a Navy ship. It was an attack cargo ship, which meant it had the cranes for loading the cargo off of the pier into its holds and then loading it up, you know, outloading it at the other end. And then it also had anti-aircraft guns and cannon so that it could defend itself as well as engage in combat when it needed to. The War Department decided that it needed about 30 of these ships for the Pacific Fleet, which was where the Warwick spent its entire career. And of that 30, it decided to name one after Warwick County. The Warwick launched in May of 1944. She sailed with a complement of 36 officers and 330 sailors. She served with distinction, earning 4 total battle stars. 2 in World War II at Luzon and at Iwo Jima, and then for 2 different campaigns during the Korean War. Her fate, and you know, a lot of warships do not have a happy ending. Her fate was to serve as a target for a U.S. submarine on gunnery drills. She was torpedoed and sunk off the coast of Washington State in May of 1972. But to find out how the ship got its name and how the county got its name, we go back to 1811. And now many of you, a lot of historians in the room, you probably already know this story. But it was, we have to talk about Captain Jacob Warwick. He was an Indiana militia leader, and he was killed in the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Now you know that battle was fought on what is now the ground under Tippecanoe County, where West Lafayette and Purdue University are up there. Warwick County was established in 1813. That was 2 years after he died. And it was named in his honor at the direction of William Henry Harrison. Now Harrison was Warwick's commanding officer at Tippecanoe. He was also Indiana's governor for 12 years and the 9th U.S. president for 1 month. He died 32 days after taking office. Aside from the U.S. Navy warship, Warwick County is known in World War I for a factory making underwear for the military. Boonville was the location, and the name of the firm was Embassy Apparel. Has anybody heard of Embassy Apparel? Well, I will cover this underwear story briefly. You're welcome, I love you. Before and after World War II, Embassy Apparel was better known to customers of luxury retailers such as Neiman Marcus, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Bloomingdale's. The firm got its start in Boonville in 1923 and became known as a maker of elegant garments and made of expensive materials. Even their underwear for the luxury customers required dry cleaning. Embassy's underwear for the military was made out of very different materials and was far more durable. After the war, the following 30 years were pretty good to Embassy. My sources tell me they put Boonville, Indiana on the map and in front of some very well-known people. For instance, President Lyndon Johnson ordered his custom-made pajamas through Neiman Marcus that were made at Embassy. Actor and singer Perry Como ordered his shirts there. And Christian Dior, a world-renowned fashion house, they had their shirts made in Boonville, Indiana for a time. At its peak, Embassy employed about 200 people, but by 1977, that number was about half of that, and it was in that year that they closed their doors. Finally, I know that the Bluegrass State is well represented here this evening, and so I want to include an item about the Kenrad Tube and Lamp Corporation of Owensboro, Kentucky. The company got its start making, really as a pioneer maker of incandescent light bulbs. In 1922, the company expanded into making vacuum tubes for radios. Now, that was a long time ago, and not all of us are familiar with vacuum tubes, but they were the silicon chips of their day. The company had to add 3 factories to keep up with the demand, and this is pre-war. Kenrad secured several government and defense contracts during World War II, and naturally became a very important part of the war effort. When Kenrad's production of vacuum tubes was threatened by an employee strike in 1944, the Department of War seized the factory under the direction of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR's action to seize Kenrad in wartime is one example of a presidential order. Another example came from Harry Truman, one that elevates the lasting relevancy of the Tuskegee Airmen legacy. Last year, 2023, marked the 75th anniversary of President Truman's executive order that integrated our armed forces. The military officer who is now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Brown Jr., gave a speech commemorating the anniversary. General Brown noted the most famous example of integration came from the Air Force, and he referenced the Tuskegee Airmen. He said that their progress is what made it possible for him to stand and give that speech that day. General Brown also said that he hoped his career and those of many other people of color rising through the ranks of the armed forces would eventually be, in his mind and in his words, less remarkable. He said, "I hope that one day progress will mean that there are no more firsts to be celebrated, that we are all left celebrating each other's achievements as fellow Americans." Thank you so much. If there's questions, I'm glad to take them. Yes, sir.
I'm going to come around with the mic here. All right, and you're probably going to hold it closer than you're comfortable with, okay?
Are there any surviving members of the Tuskegee Airmen Corps?
Of the bombardment group, none that I know of. I believe there are still a few. The numbers are getting very small from the Raytails.
Producing, making this?
Probably 100, 120, something like that. If I had to put pencil to paper.
I don't know if this is a question or really a comment, but you did answer both of my questions
Oh, very
that I
well.
had downstairs about the Indiana connection. which I had never ever heard that before. So I thought that was really very fascinating, and why you picked to do a film about the Tuskegee Airmen, and it was the connection with the student from North.
Right.
So I thought that was very interesting, and I love it when I learn new things, and I've learned something new today.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
I was so impressed with the film selections that you found. And I'm just wondering, how do you go about finding this kind of film archives? How does that happen? Could an average person here find out this kind of stuff?
Sure.
Or is it because of your background with Wartime Museum that you've got a bunch of insider knowledge? So in other words, how do you collect this stuff?
You know, that's a very good question, and all of them have been good questions. But a lot of our source material came from one film. There was a wartime film made, I believe it was called Wings for These Men, and it was about the Tuskegee Airmen. And some of the action footage, the live footage, we were able to get there. As a side note, that film was narrated by Ronald Reagan. That was one of his projects. Then the other footage, there was the Internet Archive, which has a lot of rabbit holes that you'll chase down. We found some things there. You know, we had a few people helping us with research at the Indiana Archives. They sent us a lot of still photos of Freeman Field that we wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. And there were some U.S. government resources in terms of the documents. And of course you find also that there are different collections of documents that are held by different university libraries all over the country. If we had to fly everywhere to get this stuff, we'd probably still be traveling. But through the internet, we were able to pull a lot of these things from those archives. Does that answer your question? Some of my favorite footage, I think it was some clips about Doolittle's raid. That's where some of the B-25 stuff came from. So, because we wanted to talk about, these engines were so close to the fuselage, and a lot of people did. There was a movie director that was over there. 5 came back, and I can't remember his name, but I think it was Billy Wilder. He lost his hearing from flying in a B-25 just a couple of times.
Why was the red tail red?
My best understanding of that is that when the bombers were, they had to stay on a course. They couldn't do a lot of deviation going in, and their escort aircraft would change because the escort aircraft did not have the fuel. They couldn't fly as far. So one group might accompany them across the channel, then another group would pick them up over France, and then a third group might pick them up closer to the target. So different squadrons came up with different ways of identifying their aircraft as friendlies. And the red tails, it stood out against the clouds and it stood out against the blue sky. So that was more or less where it came from.
Don't know whether it was fact or movie magic, but when they started out, only the trim tab was painted red, and it was Benjamin Davis said, "No, we want something flashy. Paint the whole tail red, so they can see us."
Was that in the Tuskegee Airmen film?
Yes.
That could have been. I don't know. Now Benjamin O. Davis, he's a very interesting guy. His father was the first black general in the U.S. Army, and his father was among the military personnel who went in to convince FDR that an all-black flying unit needed to be set up. FDR kind of had to be dragged screaming and kicking just a little bit to do it, but he did it. And then, of course, Benjamin Davis himself became the first black general in the Air Force. So you have father and son firsts there.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
Steve, was the Tuskegee Airmen, were they from a particular part of the country, or were they from all over the United States?
As far as I know, they were from all over the United States. They were drafted or enlisted just like anyone else. And then there was a selection process. I guess it's a series of aptitude tests that the Army would administer because you needed certain aptitudes, either ground crew or flight crew or as the case may be. And so that was kind of the first cut. And so you'd go to Tuskegee and go through the processes down there. But as best I know, they came from all over the country.
Anyone here in the middle?
The facilities at these two bases here in Indiana, are the airfields still present, or are they long gone? Do you know?
Freeman Field has been turned into a recreational facility for the most part for city, Seymour nearby. But there is a museum there that it has some Tuskegee history there. Also, interestingly, there were certain captured aircraft and rocketry that was brought back from Germany, wherever they found it, brought to Freeman Field, and they test flew. They did static testing on some of the rockets there, and apparently there's been a project underway because what the Army and what the military often does with things they don't need is they bury it somewhere. And so they started burying things on Freeman Field, and I think they've had some luck in digging up some of those artifacts. So the museum, you might want to check their website to see exactly when they are open, but it's an interesting endeavor. Then Atterbury, it remains, I believe it is still an active base.
It is.
And there is also the Atterbury Bacalar Museum that is it connected with the base? It's somewhere near Columbus. That's another, if you're going to Freeman and you have the time going over there. And since we're in that part of the country, there's something else I want to throw in. I don't get to talk about it very much, but since you asked the question, it has nothing to do with that. Kathy and I were driving through Washington, Indiana the other night, and you know during World War II, Washington, Indiana, along, I think it was Madisonville, Indiana, were two of the parachute-making capitals of the world. There was a garment company there that was making women's clothing out of nylon material. And when the bids were going out for someone to make parachutes, it was reasoned, well, a parachute is a pattern, and it's made out of nylon. So at one point, I forget how many thousands of parachutes came out of there. There is a historical society, not to take away from Newburgh Museum. Be sure to start your day here and then go to other places. But they have some of the parachutes that were made there and some of the history. And then the other thing they turned me on to was that they had to flight test some of their parachutes. So when you need to do flight testing of something, who do you get? You get a member of the Wright family. And it was the cousin of Wilbur and Orville who took the parachutes up on like a 55 or 60 pound weight. And then at the right altitude, shove it out the door. And that was how you tested that that parachute was okay.